Welcome to part 2 of this 2-part video series. I'm not sure what I've titled it yet, but hopefully it's something good. I just can't say what that is now. If you haven't seen the first video, go back and watch that because it'll make this video make a lot more sense. Or don't. I'm not your parent. Do what you want. In case you don't want to go back and watch it, here's a quick recap of what you've missed.
That's really strange.
Oh, weird.
You
are correct.
Bring it down.
Yeah. This is intellectual.
Schizophrenic.
Insanity.
It will die.
Go have sex and die.
So without further ado, let's get into the second part of this video. Evangelical Reacts. Part 2.
Can I get a statistic in here? There's just studies. Institute for Family Studies, there's some government websites that just talk about how, like, do you want to be happy in marriage? Well, don't have sex before marriage. Literally, that's the statistic is the more you have sex outside of marriage, the more unhappy you are in marriage.
Wow.
That's just a fact of studies.
So secular, like non-Christian people are saying.
Just then they keep studying it because I guess they want a different answer. Like, they're not going to get a different one because what God said has said in His Word is just facts of life.
Yeah. All right, sweet. So he's citing research, which is always a good sign because it gives us a glimpse into the information that is fueling their argument, and it also gives us the ability to check the validity of said argument. The crux of citing research, however, is making sure that the thing you're referencing is credible. So let's take a look. So obviously, first of all, government websites means nothing, but it sure does sound good to have whole government supporting your claim. So it's nice to pepper that in every now and then just to keep people on their toes, spice things up.
Oh yeah, I'm recognized globally as the literal coolest person on earth. You'll find that on some government websites.
So before looking for the research that he's citing, I wanted to learn more about the Institute for Family Studies, or IFS for short. Besides their name already sounding to me like a name a Christian or conservative would choose, their mission statement is pretty nondescript and benign. So I kept scrolling and found the praise they decided to post on their website. The quotes are obviously simple and vague niceties, and they're meant to boost our trust in the Institute and help their cause by using trustworthy people. So I looked into these three to see with whom the IFS chose to associate and who chose to associate themselves with the IFS. First up is Ross Duthat. Not sure, I think that's how you say his name. Ross is an American conservative political analyst, blogger, author, and New York Times columnist. He was a senior editor of The Atlantic. He has written on a variety of conservative topics, including the state of Christianity in America, weird, and sustainable decadence in contemporary society. I'm curious about that one, to be honest. How can we keep the decadence going, even though decadence is killing us, is kind of what it sounds like to me. We have to find a way to keep the decadence sustainable, people. These fucking candy bars aren't gonna hold us up forever. Next up is R.R. Reno. He's the editor of First Things magazine, which apparently is America's most influential journal of religion and public life, I guess. When you visit their website, you're greeted with a dialogue box that asserts their confidence that it's God above who oversees our victories and setbacks, and how this confidence allows them to see clearly and speak soberly during uncertain times, which is reassuring. And you also immediately see their willingness to participate in COVID denialism, as it's the first article they chose to advertise when you visit the site. So this is all very reassuring. And finally, we have Kay Heimowitz, and while I didn't immediately find ties to conservative and Christian ideologies like with the other two, I was intrigued by the title of her book, Manning Up: How the Rise of Women Has Turned Men into Boys. Because on its face, it sounds to me like it's fueled by toxic masculinity and has the semblance of anti-feminist rhetoric. But I haven't read the book, so I can't say. Those who have read the book, however, have much to say about it. So let's take a look. The top 2 reviews listed on Amazon are 1-star verified purchase reviews that accuse the book of being full of misandry, extreme right-wing sexist and racist writing, an insult to strong, independent women, and views from the last century. Obviously, 2 reviews don't encapsulate everyone's opinions, but a quick look through the other tiers show you that at 2 stars, this reader wants to rework the thesis of the entire book. At 3 stars, Co Morgan thinks the book sounds like a woman venting about men most of the time. And at 4 stars, A. Dolan may agree with some of the main arguments, but says that the specifics are dated and the overall editing was lacking. Finally, a 5-star review, which is usually reserved for people who love it, makes sure we know that these 5 stars do not mean mean that they love it. So in sum, all three characters IFS chose to help represent their brand seem to, at the very least, lean towards conservative viewpoints or even be heavily engaged in Christian rhetoric. I think it's fair to assume that the Institute's inclusion of these three people is an endorsement of their beliefs, and I find it disturbing that people who believe these things endorse the IFS. I was also interested in finding if anyone has reported on the general leaning or bias of the IFS, and I found on MediaBiasFactChecker.com, which is an independent online media outlet that reports on media bias and deceptive news practices, that their factual reporting is mixed, and they have a strong bias towards conservative causes, stating that while most of the information on the site is rooted in fact and is well sourced, they may use loaded words, publish misleading reports, omit important information that might damage conservative causes, and sometimes rely on poor science. Now, speaking of poor science, I will mention that I was able to find the research articles that Zach was talking about, but it's also important to mention that I couldn't find these articles published anywhere except on the Institute's website and cited by some media outlets, including the fundamentalist Christian organization Focus on the Family, the Catholic News Agency, and The Atlantic for some reason. I checked, and even though Ross Duthat was an editor at The Atlantic, it was many years prior to this article. But still, it's interesting that there's some crossover here. So, we've got some hard hitters here, and it's really exactly what one wants to find when discerning the credibility of one's cited research. Now on to the articles. Like I said, I was able to find what I think is the research he's talking about.
There's some government websites.
I found two articles, actually. One called Counterintuitive Trends in the Link Between Pre-Marital Sex and Marital Stability, and the other is called Does Sexual History Affect Marital Happiness? Both are written by Nicholas F. Wolfinger, a professor at the University of Utah, and who looks like Willy Wonka if he was a professor at the University of Utah. But instead of traumatizing children with near-death experiences via candy, he uses his potbelly pig. So I read through what Mr. Wolfinger had to say about the old fling before the ring, and I was intrigued yet uncomfortable. In the first article, I was a little flustered but not surprised when I found out that the research it uses focused only on women as the subject of the research, which boorishly reads to me as the continuation of disproportionate policing and controlling of women's sexuality and their bodies. Even more disturbing to me was the language used around certain sentences containing the word virgin. For example, the sentence, "Certainly fewer men entered marriage with the expectation of a virgin bride," just kind of hits me the wrong way. You know, it harkens back to this idea that men expect women to be virgins before marrying them, otherwise they're not fit as a bride or somehow not whole or complete as a person, which I find to be alarming. I know you may be thinking,
well, this is an article about sex, and virgin is a culturally accepted term for someone who hasn't had sex yet, so it makes sense that he would talk about it.
That's true, but when you've established that this is a heavily conservative and sometimes Christian-leaning institution, it becomes difficult to divorce the religious connotations associated with these poorly written sentences. This is especially true when you've grown up in purity culture like I have, and like Girl Defined is talking about in their video.
Having sex before marriage is what God calls a sin.
You still may be thinking I'm reading too deeply into what he's saying, and I'm willing to hear that, and I'm willing for that to be true. But I would also say it becomes increasingly difficult to interpret his words much differently when you continue reading and find that he found it pertinent to include research about how many women were still going to church. I found out later that some of the research he's using used other control factors like age, race, and socioeconomic backgrounds, but he chose to highlight the church graph. In the same article, Wolfinger states, earlier research found that having multiple sex partners prior to marriage could lead to less happy marriages and often increased the odds of divorce. But sexual attitudes and behaviors continued to change in America, and some of the strongest predictors of divorce in years gone by no longer matter as much as they once did. To me, this is an important acknowledgement when considering the causality between premarital sex and marital happiness or stability, so I'm glad that he did. Culture and beliefs change, and we're coming out of a heavily Christian era where people's everyday decisions included their Christian beliefs, which is going to have a major effect on people's perceptions of non-Christian actions like having sex before marriage. I felt that in the rest of this article there wasn't much consideration given to this aspect. He then references research that found that women with fewer sexual partners were less likely to divorce. He doesn't cite that source, so I can't check what he's talking about there, but I feel it's important to note that measuring divorce is different than measuring happiness in a marriage. And happiness is what Zach is talking about in the video.
Do you want to be happy in marriage?
But this article is largely talking about divorce. And plenty of people who aren't happy in their marriages never divorce. Wolfinger even notes later in the article that until the 2010s, women who only had 2 sexual partners were the ones getting divorced more often than any other category, including women who had 10 or more partners, which Wolfinger says is surprising. So I would think that this trend insinuates that it doesn't necessarily have to do with how many sexual partners a person has had, and could be attributed to changing cultural beliefs about things like sex before marriage and divorce. Wolfinger goes on to try to explain these results and admits that religious people are most often the ones observing abstaining from sex before marriage. He also admits that going to church doesn't necessarily reflect religiosity, and states that findings concerning religion should be viewed as suggestive rather than definitive. This is another reason why I feel like it was unnecessary to specifically highlight the church graph. Wolfinger's overall explanation for these trends is what he calls overemphasized comparisons, by which he means that women with 2 partners are often still newly convinced that there's sexual possibility outside of the person they married, whereas women who've had more sexual partners already know what exploring possibilities is like and are more aware of the seriousness of a long-term relationship. To his credit, he does say that this issue is complex and says a full understanding is beyond the scope of this report, and this research brief paints a fairly complicated picture of the association between sex and marital stability that ultimately raises more questions than it answers. So for me, this is a far cry from any definitive answers on the matter.
What God has said in his word is just facts of life.
Yeah.
And I'd also say it even implies the number of sexual partners can't be shown to be causal in relation to divorce.
That's just a fact.
Instead of diving into the second article as well, suffice it to say that Wolfinger references the article we just went over and says, survey respondents who tied the knot as virgins had the lowest divorce rates, but beyond that, the relationship between sexual biography and marital stability was less clear. Having multiple partners generally doesn't increase the odds of divorce any more than having just a few does so. To wrap up this section, I wanted to see if there was any peer-reviewed research covering the causality between sex before marriage and the happiness in and the stability of a marriage. Wolfinger linked to a couple in his article, which is helpful. In the first paper, while they do say there's a link between premarital sex and marital dissolution, they say that these factors alone don't indicate everything that goes into weakening a marriage. And they even say having sex and living with your future spouse has become a normal part of the process. So the research Zach is quoting is incidentally also saying like,
Yeah, it's fine. You guys could have had sex with each other without any statistical difference in the possibility of you getting a divorce.
That's just a fact.
The second research paper I was able to find mentions in their abstract that personality characteristics were the things being measured and included sexual history variables, but it's not really focused on the causality of premarital sex and marital happiness. And again, they're talking about divorce, which is often a side effect of unhappy marriages, but not for everyone, since not every unhappy marriage gets dissolved. And this research isn't just talking about premarital sex being the thing that people care about. Finally, the last research paper I found really did examine the relationship between premarital sex and the long-term risk of divorce, and they determined, and I quote, "These results suggest that the positive relationship between premarital sex and the risk of divorce can be attributed to prior unobserved differences, e.g. the willingness to break traditional norms, rather than to a direct causal effect." So what is this all saying? Too long didn't read. The main point is that Zach's claims,
literally, that's the statistic is, the more you have sex outside of marriage, the more unhappy you are in marriage.
is laughably naive at best and willfully ignorant at worst. So, now that we've cleared that up, let's keep going.
Yeah, and I think that backs up scripture in so many ways. Like as Christians, we can have scripture and then we can also have science. And so often they complement one another. And it's just a reminder that God, like you were saying, God's design is for us. He's not against us.
No. Absolutely fucking not. You don't get to have it both ways. Christians are some of the biggest science deniers in the entire fucking world and throughout all of history, unless they're able to find a way to make science fit into their beliefs somehow. Then they're like,
Oh yeah, me and science go way back. How long has it been, science?
4.5 billion years.
Science, you're such a killer. It's been like 6,000 years at most.
What the fuck? You're the worst friend.
Whatever. Anyway, me and science are like this.
And I think so often we can have this perspective that God is just a killjoy in the sky, right? Like he wants to squish our fun, squish our passion, and give us this bland life where we're just like literally sitting there, not even laughing or smiling. But God is a God of passion, and he created sex, and he created it to be an amazing, beautiful experience, like filled with ecstasy and wonder and exploration.
God creating sex to be amazing is a recent development in Christian rhetoric. It used to be,
Wives, submit to your husbands.
and any kind of talk outside of condemning sex before marriage was just ignored. So when they saw that wasn't working anymore, they switched it up and decided to be like,
Oh yeah, God loves sex. He wants it to be so good for you, and for you to have the best sex possible. But here's the thing. It only works if you do it the way he likes it. God's kink is other people getting married. You don't want to kink shame God, do you? Then get married, you fornicator!
You're saying, I'm waiting for something so awesome.
Yeah,
and I
so
think
much
that's
better.
the
Yeah,
perspective
so much
that
better.
so many of us.
so much better. Bitch, what makes it better? To know that you're following the rules? You can't actually know the difference because you didn't do the other one. And even if you did, you were most likely so full of shame that you beat yourself up about it down at the altar call until you resolved to never do it again until you were married. And of course that would be better because you're no longer ashamed of your choices.
Was it worth it? We all chose to wait until marriage to have sex. And so now looking back, we're 6 months looking back. Y'all are 8 years looking back.
Right.
Was it worth it?
Why even watch this part? It's just gonna be them saying,
Oh, absolutely, 100% yes.
in different ways. And what are they gonna do? Say no? You think they're gonna put their personal struggles on blast and ruin their witnessing opportunity to bring people to Jesus and save their sinning souls? Fuck no. Even if they were dying to say no, they'd bottle that shit up until the end of days.
Like, I've experienced so much joy with just being with Kristen that I can't imagine anything else.
Yeah.
You don't have much of an imagination, my guy.
It's just so beautiful because there's that freedom to just explore and enjoy knowing you're not going anywhere. We're going to be together. Whether I'm bad at this, good at this, we can just enjoy and learn together.
She's like,
You're not leaving my side.
and look at him. He's like,
Yeah, I won't leave.
and then right after that, Dave gives Bethany a kiss. You can see like the silent communication going on between them. She looks over and is like,
You're gonna be with me forever too.
and he's like,
Of course, baby, don't worry, I'm right here.
bro, the way he's rubbing her finger. I just noticed it happening. It's weirding me the fuck out. Look at this. I mean, look at him. He's like,
Oh my god, I'm so horny. How long are we gonna talk about sex? I just wanna go do it for Christ's sake. Oh, sorry, Lord, I didn't mean to use your name in vain. I'm just so goddamn horny.
she said they've only been together 6 months, so it makes sense he'd be rearing to go. We find out later that Dave and Bethany waited almost 30 years to have sex with somebody. So they're still in the novel phase of this.
I think there's this perspective in the culture, like, you got to be good at these things, right? Like, you practice and test drive things.
Well, and what is good?
Yeah.
True. What's the standard?
So athletic and other things. Okay, but I mean, get rid of that. That's totally an
expectation.
narrative, an
that's-
expectation that is just hooey.
Dude, they're like,
What even is good? Why does one have to be athletic in bed to be good at sex? What does it mean to last a long time? Where even is the clitoris?
and she's like,
That's just an expectation, baby. Don't worry, that's all hooey. I'm sure together we'll find my clitoris someday.
You're not looking at me saying, like, you have to be perfect, and I'm expecting, like, these moves, It's like, there's, like, you're saying, like, some acrobat. I don't know.
What do you want from me? Yeah.
he's really trying to air these grievances right now. She's like,
We should maybe work on trying some new moves and switching it up a bit. We've been married for 8 years after all.
and he's just like,
What do you want from me?
I'm finding that there is a sweetness that is actually growing.
Yeah.
And that lines up with neurological research. And the more connected sex you're having with one person, the more your brain gets tied and starts to associate sex with that person. So sex outside of marriage is making promises, breaking promises, making promises, breaking promises.
Please do not quote any more research. It took me days to flesh out that last fucking citation. And that turned out to be hooey. I think I vaguely know what he's getting at here. It sounds like he's referencing bonding chemicals that get released in the brain like dopamine and oxytocin. But to call those promises is just not fucking true. Your dopamine is not getting released like...
Some forever yours. I promise I will never leave. I promise that I won't ever do anything bad. I promise that I won't do anything good. I promise that I'm your slave.
I think it's only complicated because there's just a lot of cultural narratives that are hooey.
Yeah. Hooey.
And that's honestly, I think, the one reason why we're even talking about this. You know, it's been a given for, I think, for centuries in a lot of different cultures and ways.
No. This is another one of those things that you don't get to have both ways. You don't get to be a part of one of the largest violently discriminatory organizations in all of recorded history and then be like,
See, they do it too, so it must be true. How convenient.
This is also such a trivialization of women's struggles throughout history and how marriage was begun as a way of maintaining and disseminating property. But often women were not allowed to own that property and sometimes were even considered a part of that property, which also has roots in Christianity. So no, you don't get to draw on other cultures here as a way to boost your argument. All right, so I'm going to stop it there because at this point they're just talking about how they would go back and do it all over again and how before they made the choice based on faith and now they can actually say it's better now that they've lived it. So it's useless. But I want to go back to one of the questions Bethany brought up.
What is good? Drew, what's the standard?
What even is good? That's sort of been my question for them this whole time. We don't agree on what the basis is for good, and you're trying to tell me that your version of good is better than mine and that it's better for me, even if I think my version of good is better for me. I personally don't give a fuck what you do. You can wait for marriage, and that's totally fine. And it doesn't even have to be religious for it to be okay. Like, if that's what you want to do for whatever reason, I don't care. Most people I don't think care. But for Christians, why do you have to insist so persistently on giving a fuck about what other people do? Why can't Christians just let people do what they want instead of meddling with everything from personal relationships all the way up to literal laws that dictate how people live their lives? Jesus himself may have been proselytizing all around the country to spread his ideas, but he sure as fuck wasn't wasting time trying to convince people to follow him who didn't want to. And yet, the main goal of Christianity today seems to be to control politics and culture so it doesn't shift away from archaic beliefs and decrepit power structures. Just like, figure it the fuck out. Finally, the last point I want to make is that the biggest assumption that they're making in this video is that marriage is better than non-marriage. Being married is better than not being married. Obviously, there's a lot of nuance to divorce, and like I mentioned earlier, it can often be a sign of unhappiness in a marriage. But it's not just black and white, right or wrong. There's a lot of research that talks about and shows the negative effects that divorce can have on children. But it's important to also consider how divorce can actually help people. It creates a structure for people to get out of relationships that would otherwise be harmful or abusive for the spouse and or the children. In cases like these, divorce is actually an extremely helpful option for the sanity, health, and well-being of those involved or those being abused, and would be a contributing factor to the overall happiness of usually everyone involved. So who's to say being married is better? What kind of unit of measurement is this? Apparently it's the only one that Girl Defined and their husbands use. And even if it's not the only one, I would posit that it's more harmful to make a video addressing premarital sex where you cite research that talks about divorce without giving proper credence to things like good communication, personal development, personal happiness and fulfillment, power dynamic equality, purpose and satisfaction, is the relationship abusive, a healthy communicative sex life, safe boundaries, and so on and so forth. So my advice is don't take their advice. Even if you are a Christian, I feel like this is actually pretty far from having an honest conversation about sex before marriage. If they were having an honest conversation, I feel like there would have been more conversation about how hard it actually is to uphold a belief or a stance like this in a culture that largely views it as outdated. When I believed that this was the right way to do it, it wasn't that I wanted to wait to have sex, it was that I wanted to follow the rules. I wanted to be as close to God as possible and to be as holy as possible while I was still here on planet Earth. So I wouldn't be surprised to find that there are a lot of people who are just following the rule because it is a rule, not because they want to. Even Bethany, I've seen in some of their other videos the frustration building up in not being able to find a man to have sex with in 30 years. So I feel like there would have been more about that rather than them just being like, oh, it's so awesome and like, don't believe what everybody says, it's so great, I'd do it again. I was a young teenager when I believed this, and it was fucking hard. I didn't want to not have girlfriends or explore. I wanted to follow what was naturally occurring for me and what I was naturally interested in. But I really didn't want to disappoint God and somehow end up sending myself to hell because of my choice. And I also didn't want to somehow ruin myself for my future spouse. Purity culture is largely steeped in shame, and it continues because of shame. People end up rejecting themselves of their reality because they want to make sure they adhere to the reality that they think is going to bring them everlasting life and help them avoid eternal suffering. It's designed to keep people in a loop of shame and penitence so that they keep coming back to the idea that they are worthless and they're a fuck up unless they live life the way God wants them to. So don't believe that mess. You're perfect the way you are. Your feelings are natural and fine. You don't need to listen to an archaic book to let you know that you're a good person. So that's it for this video. Thanks for tuning in and watching all the way to the end. Please make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps me out a lot, and it lets me know you're picking up what I'm putting down. So thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.